On this episode of Charged and Disbarred.
At least on 5 occasions, he had claimed the first homeowner's grant. He was quite ingenious, really, in one way, and very corrupt in another.
For almost a half a year, Mr. Landers executed a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars to banks and individuals. Mr. Landers landed in federal prison based on his own acts and his own conduct.
Judges and attorneys are like kings and knights in their own realm. It is unthinkable that in a moment of madness it can all be thrown away. Charged and Disbarred explores the true life stories of attorneys who have fallen from grace. Hear firsthand accounts from the victims, detectives, and prosecutors who brought these disgraced attorneys to justice. This is Charged and Disbarred. Yarraville, Australia, a modest and quiet suburb of Melbourne in the state of Victoria. The town is inland from Port Phillip Bay, just across from Good Island. This small Victorian-era village was once a working-class neighborhood. In recent years, commuters have moved in, drawn by charming streets lined with weatherboard homes and Queen Anne cottages decorated with cast-iron trim. Victoria University is just up the road, parks are abundant, and the train brings the city within easy reach. Affordable homes in neighborhoods like this are snatched up by younger first-time buyers looking for an affordable starter home. In Yarraville, they're likely they've gotten help from the state of Victoria in the form of a grant. But one Yarraville attorney, Anthony Robert Coleman, developed a knack for reinventing himself as a first-time homebuyer.
I'm Marlene Ebinger. I'm a lawyer from Werribee, Melbourne, Australia. I've been a lawyer for 11 years. Prior to that, I was a community worker. Decided I wanted to study law, make a difference. I've written a book on legal practice and ethics that's used by law students and some lawyers. We have to make sure that the community look upon our profession in a positive light. I do talk about lawyers who have failed their ethical duties, and really I do that because it sends a message to people who are lawyers or studying to be lawyers. If you do something wrong, eventually you'll get caught. Anthony Coleman was a suburban lawyer. He'd been practicing since about 1998, and somehow he was very clever at putting together false characters, false names, and used those to his advantage.
Divorced twice, Coleman is a father of 4 and served in the Army during his 20s.
What we had known as the first homeowner's grant. So if you purchased a home for the first time, you were eligible for a grant from the state government. So he was claiming that first homeowner's grant under several names for the same property.
Coleman handled estates, wills, and contracts. As a solo practitioner from early in his career, Coleman's practice was not guided by senior partners. He didn't learn the ropes from more experienced lawyers. Early in his legal practice, a neighbor referred a man named Eric Smith to Coleman. Smith was a friend of hers, getting on in years, and had promised to include her in his will.
During Mr. Coleman's legal career, he was asked to draft wills, and he acted for a particular client who gave him instructions to draft a will, and that will said that most of his estate was going to be distributed to charities. He'd appointed a neighbour as his executor, and if that neighbour wasn't available to be the executor of the estate, then Mr. Coleman would become the executor.
Coleman prepared this will at about the same time he changed his business to Coleman Lawyers. He also began to practice more criminal law, which brought him into contact with a less respectable class of people. He even began to socialize with some of his criminal clients. At some point, Coleman created his first alias.
In the past, you were able to get a first homeowner's grant for established houses. At the moment, it's just for new properties that are being built. And you could get around $7,000 to $10,000, it's my understanding, that you could receive as a grant. Anthony Coleman created the fictitious character of Robert Cole. He set up a bank account, even in the name of Robert Cole, and purchased a property. And when he purchased that property, he applied for the first homeowner's grant, and he was given that. So that was the first time Mr. Coleman decided to set up a fictitious name and claim a grant that he certainly wasn't eligible to receive. So following this first transaction where he set up the name of Robert Cole, he then decided to transfer the property into his de facto partner's name. So he transferred it into her name. She'd not previously owned a home, so again he applied for the first homeowner's grant and he received that.
Coleman's first alias, Robert Cole, is based on his own middle name Robert with a shortened version of his last name. Coleman would soon get more creative. In 2002, his client Eric Smith passed away at the age of 70.
This client died, and the neighbour decided to renounce her role as executor, which meant that Mr. Coleman then became the executor of the estate.
Now the client was deceased. His friend was paid her share of the estate. The charities named in the will were likely unaware that monies were even due to them. Since there would be no would-be heirs looking over his shoulder, would Coleman, as a sworn officer of the court, dutifully carry out the last will and testament of Eric Smith?
As executor, he was able to put the property that was owned by the deceased into his name as his legal representative. He also closed bank accounts, and the money from those accounts went into his lawyer's trust account. Instead of distributing the money as required by the will, Mr. Coleman decided that he would use the funds for his own purposes. He also transferred some of those funds into his de facto partner's bank account.
The cash proceeds Coleman claimed for himself from the estate were $32,000.
Mr. Coleman decided to create another fictitious name to transfer the deceased property into. This time he used the name of Patrick Bateman of American Psycho. Pretty interesting, perhaps not so unique. He even went to lengths to register Patrick Bateman on the electoral roll. That means he could vote in our elections. Again, he set up a bank account, and again he transferred this deceased property into Patrick Bateman's name. Patrick Bateman, never owning a home before, he applied for the first homeowner's grant, and he was given it.
American Psycho, the book and later movie adaptation starring Christian Bale, told the story of a character who was a wealthy investment banker by day and a misogynistic serial killer by night. The story is told entirely from the point of view of a cold, methodical killer who was the only hero in his own twisted world. Was Coleman beginning to view himself as an anti-hero?
For those of you that don't know, the character Patrick Bateman was from the movie American Psycho. It seems to me that Mr. Coleman gave a lot of thought to setting up this structure to make false claims against the State Revenue Office of Victoria to get financial gain for himself. What was he doing? Was he not lawyering? That's what his role was.
His success in transferring these two properties must have emboldened the attorney. But for each transaction, Coleman was only making a small amount of money, and fraud is a risky business. His next illegal move would take advantage of one of his living and breathing clients.
Following the transfer into Patrick Bateman's name, a while passed, and then Mr. Coleman decided he's going to transfer that same property to one of his friends' de facto's name. He didn't tell her. He'd done some legal work for her. He was able to have copies of her identity, and he used that identity again to transfer the property into her name and to once again claim the first homeowner's grant. So he claimed that grant unbeknownst to his friend's partner. She had no idea that the information she had entrusted to her lawyer was used to her disadvantage. It didn't stop there. Now it's in the name of his friend's de facto. He thinks, okay, I can make some more money. He then creates another character called Craig Young. Don't know where he got that name from. He creates the name of Craig Young, he transfers the property again, and he again receives the first homeowner's grant.
In 2005, Coleman again transferred his deceased client's real estate property to yet another fictional entity.
So all this money is going into his trust account that then he's able to access himself. He then creates the name of Max Power, taken from The Simpsons. He was quite ingenious, really, in one way, and very corrupt in another. So it's transferred to Max Power. Max Power claims the first homeowner's grant.
While The Simpsons reference might seem playful, Coleman's dark humor came out in the birth date he created for Max Power, June 6 of 1966, or written out 6666. Coleman now has been at the game for several years. He finally sells Smith's property outright as Max Power and collects $214,000. But the clock was about to run out on Coleman's real estate scams.
How does he get found out? His poor friend, the de facto of his friend, she actually buys a house. She applies for the first homeowner's grant. The State Revenue Office says to her, "No, you've already received it." She says, "No, I haven't. I haven't received the first homeowner's grant." They show her what they've got. She says, "I didn't buy that house. I've never owned that house." That's how Mr. Coleman was caught. So not only did Mr. Coleman defraud the State Revenue Office, not only did he create a whole number of fictitious bodies, he put property into the name of his de facto, he put the property into the name of his friend's de facto. He also misappropriated money from the trust account. He didn't conduct his files appropriately. And when the Legal Services Commissioner, our regulatory body, found out about his conduct, they appointed receivers to take over his firm. Now, it's a very serious matter.
Receivers are appointed by the court to come into a family business and wrap it up. This was happening while Coleman was fighting his own legal battles in court. He would receive 3 separate sentences.
In the first instance, Mr. Coleman received a 9-month prison sentence, but it was suspended for 18 months. And what that means is if he behaves for the 18-month period, then he doesn't go to jail. But within that 18-month period, if he was to commit another crime and be convicted, then he would have to serve his 9-month sentence. Mr. Coleman didn't reapply for his practicing certificate, so his certificate ended on the 30th of June 2011. But what he did when the receivers were there, and I've been told this by people that worked in the same building with him, is that he broke into the office, he got into the filing cabinets while the receivers were appointed, and he took files. And this is clearly reported and in the media and in judgments. He took files and he continued to work on those files. He no longer had a practicing certificate. If you don't hold a valid practicing certificate, you cannot practice as a lawyer. So again, he's breached the rules. The law really caught up with Mr. Coleman. And it wasn't the legal regulatory officer that took the most severe action, but criminal proceedings were brought against Mr. Coleman at the instigation of the State Revenue Office. At least on 5 occasions, he had claimed the first homeowner's grant. The State Revenue Office didn't take to that too kindly. So he was charged, he pled guilty, he was convicted. In another case brought by the State Revenue Office in the Magistrates Court, Mr. Coleman received a 4-month prison sentence, suspended for a 12-month period. In Mr. Coleman's instance, he was the first lawyer to really be charged with the highest of penalties. The law had changed not that long before, and there were criminal penalties that applied to his behaviour. They wanted to make an example. This is pretty terrible conduct. In fact, the Legal Services Commissioner said that it was the first time that agencies worked together. So the Legal Services Commissioner's Office, along with the Office of Public Prosecutions and the Victoria Police, worked together to ensure that criminal charges were brought against Mr. Coleman. Why did Mr. Coleman create these names, transfer property like a roundabout, claim money that he was not entitled to? Who knows why? In his plea, when he pled guilty, Essentially, he had character references to say, what a good person he was, how he did things in the community. They also talked about that, he had mental health problems. To maintain your practicing certificate each year, you must prove that you are a fit and proper person to hold the office of a lawyer.
Photographs or images of this attorney are no longer available to the public.
We can all say we had a bad day, but this person didn't have a bad day. Over a period of time, he created a number of false names, false characters. He stole money from an estate where he was entrusted as the lawyer by the person who made the will. He stole that person's money. I'm not quite sure it's good enough excuse to say I was suffering with some mental health problems. I think we need to take responsibility for our actions. So for some reason, he decided that he'll try and make some extra money, and he made the extra money on his client's back. It was fraud. Can't call it anything else. I think justice was served in the case of Anthony Coleman. But let's remember, Anthony Coleman was a suburban lawyer. He was made an example of. There are other lawyers who've had many, many complaints made against them, who really should also be struck off, but somehow continue to survive.
Still to come on Charged and Disbarred.
For almost a half a year, Mr. Landers executed a sophisticated Ponzi scheme costing hundreds of thousands of dollars to banks and individuals. Mr. Landers landed in federal prison based on his own acts and his own conduct.
This is Charged and Disbarred.
In 2006, the real estate market in Duluth, Georgia was enjoying the same upward spiral as the rest of America. Charming antebellum style homes with wraparound verandas, southern colonials, new country club communities with custom built homes, all steadily increasing in value year after year. If people weren't buying or selling houses, they were busy refinancing to take advantage of low mortgage rates. The median home price in this northeastern suburb of Atlanta hovered around $200,000. What no one knew in 2006 was that the market had just peaked. The heyday, which had sparked even middle-class investors to speculate in real estate, was over. One of those investors was a real estate lawyer named Neil Harley Landers.
The Great Recession affected many in the real estate industry. However, Mr. Landers landed in federal prison based on his own acts and his own conduct.
Landers had done a brisk business as a real estate closing attorney during the biggest housing bubble of all time. A religious man, Landers lost his father when he was 2 and his mother at age 18. He attended Catholic schools when possible. Landers earned his law degree from Northern Illinois University College of Law. Business was so good in 2006, Landers got into the market himself with 2 properties. And why not? He was a real estate professional. His brother was an investment banker. Mortgages were easy to get, and values just kept climbing with no end in sight. Landers was immersed in the culture of the housing boom. Of course, the key to making money in a bull market is knowing when to sell. But even when business was good, Landers was struggling to balance his books. Not only had he overextended himself buying real estate, he had commingled his personal and business accounts, and worse, his legal trust account. At some point, Landers unwisely decided he could illegally draw on that trust account to pay for personal and business expenses. He basically extended himself a line of credit using other people's money. At the market's peak, Landers' office might handle 1 or more closings per day as the title agent. Now Landers was standing on the precipice of the subprime mortgage crisis. At the end of 2006, large banks finally realized they had been making big bets on bad mortgages. Much of the market boom was driven by a massive institutional fraud. Banks had made questionable loans known as subprime mortgages to people who might not be able to pay them back. This was not illegal. However, the banks were then bundling these iffy loans together with good loans as mortgage-backed securities and routinely selling them as though they were high-quality investments. lending slowed. Neil Landers' practice was already making late settlement payments and failing to record deeds, which surely affected his business. But in 2007, the economy made Landers' problems worse. The number of real estate deals across the country suddenly plummeted. Practically overnight, Landers went from handling 20 to 25 transactions a month to about 6. And that's when Landers' situation spun out of control. Landers had converted his trust account into a slush fund, and now the fund was quickly drying up. He couldn't cover his closings. He was rolling the debt forward to be covered by new transactions.
Mr. Landers was having money transferred into his escrow account. That money was supposed to be transferred to the seller of the house. Instead, Mr. Landers was keeping that money, and he was using that to pay back old loans, or he was using that for personal expenses.
The process of using new incoming money to fill the financial gap created by Landers' illegal borrowing is the hallmark of a Ponzi scheme. Landers attempted to catch up, but failed. To make matters worse, his poor choices would create even more complex problems. Wire fraud.
Under federal law, it's illegal to spend ill-gotten gains. So when Mr. Landers transferred money from his escrow account into his personal checking account, those were illegal transfers because he was effectively laundering money.
Instead of coming clean, Landers repeatedly dug himself into a deeper hole. He probably imagined he could simply repay the funds when his cash flow got better, and no one would be the wiser. But that didn't happen. The escrow account balance became so low, Landers was no longer able to complete timely closing. He delayed payments for days and even months. In his own defense, Landers later claimed that another factor was affecting his judgment. During this time, he had been receiving injections for long-term testosterone therapy. He says the effect the hormone had on him was euphoric. He claimed that the therapy made him overconfident. He attributed his poor investments and excessive spending to the effects of the testosterone. In federal court filings, Landers claimed he received his last injection in November of 2006, which was followed by depression, feelings of hopelessness, weight gain, alcoholism, and suicidal thoughts throughout 2007. But rather than seeking help, Landers continued his attempts to correct his financial problems with a now failing business. In June of 2007, Landers devised a scheme to fool Washington Mutual Bank into making a personal loan to him.
Landers took a loan from Washington Mutual Bank in the amount of approximately $228,000. He took that money so he could perpetrate and perpetuate the Ponzi scheme. He used that money to pay off some of the other loans that should have been paid off in the past.
In court documents, Landers claimed that the loan was an attempt to transfer at least part of his debt to the trust account into his own name. But Landers wasn't out of the woods yet. When the fraudulent loan didn't fix his problems, a month later, he attempted to replace the missing money by writing 2 very bad checks. He opened a new account with SunTrust Bank, wrote checks both in excess of $200,000 from SunTrust to his mismanaged trust account at Wachovia Bank.
The banks realized the scheme in about 4 days.
Shortly thereafter, one of his clients, a title insurance company which had seen a pattern of problems with Landers' settlement work, filed a grievance with the Georgia bar. Landers' Ponzi scheme had finally run out of road. Litigation ensued, and the title insurance companies stepped in. In 2008, the Georgia bar suspended Landers' license to practice law based on complaints and on their own investigation into wrongdoing. They found that he had mismanaged his trust account and failed his fiduciary obligations to his clients. Landers was finally disbarred in February of 2009. But it would get worse for the former real estate attorney. Later that year, the FBI would begin looking into his fraudulent activities. Based on that investigation, a federal grand jury returned an indictment against Landers in 2012.
The amount of time between when the FBI received the original complaint against Mr. Landers and indictment was about 2.5 years, which is not a particularly long amount of time considering how complex the crime was and how extensive the FBI investigation was.
At trial, Landers admitted to his wrongdoing. Because the charges included money laundering, Landers forfeited all of his property that was in any way connected to his crimes.
One of the victims of Mr. Landers' scheme was his brother, Patrick Landers. Although Mr. Landers' brother did not speak at his behalf at his sentencing, Mr. Landers' sister did.
Landers was found guilty. In the sentencing phase of the trial, Landers claimed his use of testosterone had contributed significantly to his poor judgment. His claims were supported by a doctor's statement. He also described the market conditions that resulted from the subprime mortgage debacle as part of his defense. Perhaps more compelling, though, was Landers' claim that he made his and his brother's situation worse with his effort to somehow repay the money owed through the trust account. Landers' pleading describes a man who got in over his head and went to a considerable and misguided effort to right his wrongs. His sentencing memorandum also details a long history of community service through various churches he attended over the years.
For almost a half a year, Mr. Landers executed a sophisticated Ponzi scheme costing hundreds of thousands of dollars to banks and individuals. Mr. Landers served his time as FCI Beckley, which is a federal prison in West Virginia. For his conduct, he landed in jail for 27 months, and he deserved every day of his sentence.
The court ordered Landers to pay restitution of over $850,000. Some of that money is owed to his brother for one of the real estate transactions Landers mishandled.
Thus far, Mr. Landers has continued to make the restitution payments as ordered by the court.
Landers served time in federal prison for his financial crimes. The lawyer admitted his guilt in making poor decisions based on his own misplaced optimism and exuberance about the booming housing market. But Landers' assumptions about the market were identical to the groupthink that infected the bankers and mortgage brokers he dealt with every day. According to the New York Times, large institutions such as Lehman Brothers, AIG, Citigroup, and Countrywide all revised their earnings statements to reveal losses that had been hidden. These banks systematically concealed material information from shareholders. In fact, banks had mislabeled and sold toxic assets in a vast scheme that brought the world's economy to its knees. To date, only one banker has been convicted for crimes related to the financial crisis. Landers' words and actions seem to indicate genuine remorse for his theft and fraud. However, he is no longer permitted to practice law. Landers is now a Georgia business consultant.
I do not view the question of an attorney any different than any other case. In every case, we look for the facts,